So what I want to do tonight is talk a bit about coyotes' life history and specifically about some of the research that we've done on coyotes over the years, not only in Ontario but in other places. And my goal would be to shed light and help you understand a little more about these animals that you're seeing and in some cases having negative encounters with in your neighborhood. So the very first thing that you need to know about coyotes in Ontario is that they're not native to Ontario. And when Europeans first colonized North America, coyotes had a distribution in North America that was restricted largely to the Central Plains area of the continent. And it was land clearing for agriculture and settlement and the removal of other large predators that we did that really made landscape conditions favorable for coyotes and really facilitated this massive range expansion by coyotes. So in Ontario, south of the Canadian Shield, if you see a wild four-legged canid running around, it is probably a coyote. Generally, the breeding distribution or the breeding range of wolves in the province is restricted to areas north of the sort of southern edge of the Canadian Shield. So yeah. And that's really the main thing you need to know about this slide. We have two other wolf species in the province in addition to coyotes, eastern wolves that are centered in and around Algonquin Park and sort of south of the French River. And as you get further north, we have larger wolves that are generally sort of a hybrid between a gray and an eastern wolf further north. But we don't have those animals down here. We're not dealing with things like that. So coyotes weren't native to Ontario. And I mentioned that changes that we made to the landscape across the continent facilitated a massive range expansion by coyotes. The first confirmed coyote in the province was killed in Lambton County in 1919. Over the next few decades, coyotes began to spread in the province, and those first coyotes that colonized the province met our eastern wolves that had a distribution at that time that was a little further south than it is today, and in fact they did hybridize or interbreed with our eastern wolves. So all the coyotes that went on to colonize eastern Canada and the northeastern United States carried with them some wolf DNA that they picked up here in Ontario. And today, every coyote that we're aware of in the province has some wolf DNA in it. But this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that occurred in the mid-20th century, and in recent decades, you know, the coyotes are all genetically similar to each other and all, you know, quite similar. So we'll get more on that in a minute. So in the media, there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about coy wolves and what is a coy wolf. And the way it's painted in the media, it makes people think that there's something new happening and that things are changing as we speak on the landscape. And we just don't believe that's the case, and in fact have no evidence that that's the case. So a coy wolf, or what people are calling a coy wolf, is the same thing that I'm referring to as an eastern coyote, which, as I just mentioned, is in fact an animal of hybrid origin. It's the result of hybridization in the mid-20th century between western coyotes and eastern wolves. But again, all the coyotes in Ontario, all the eastern coyotes in Ontario are the same thing that some people are calling coy wolves. I don't like the word coy wolf because these animals, both genetically and physically, and even in terms of their behavior, they maintain features that are much more similar to what we would expect from coyotes than from wolves. So I find the term coy wolf a little bit misleading. So coy wolf is the same old eastern coyote, and the only place in Ontario where that word might actually be appropriate would be up around areas just outside Algonquin. So in Parry Sound District and in some areas, we actually do rarely have cases where a typical eastern coyote of today would hybridize or cross with an eastern wolf. But those events are fairly infrequent, and they really have no impact or bearing on what's going on down here in the GTA. So all coyotes in Ontario are of hybrid origin. They all have some wolf blood in them. So one of the first questions then that arises from that is whether or not the presence of some wolf ancestry in our eastern coyotes makes them any more prone to get in trouble or less fearful of people. And again, I would say that there's no evidence that that's the case. And we tend to view problems sort of myopically and based on what we see in our immediate surroundings in our own backyard. But if we take a broader view here, issues with coyotes in neighborhoods and coyotes feeding on pets are no less rare in places like Denver, Colorado, or in areas of California and so on. In those areas where coyotes are small western coyotes that have absolutely no history of hybridizing with wolves. So the presence of wolf blood really, there's no evidence that it has anything to do with any sort of behavioral changes. And in fact, if you think about it, and I'll show you in a little bit, the coyotes, one of the big behavioral differences between a coyote and a wolf is that coyotes will live in our backyards and live very close to people and close to very developed urban areas. And that's the farthest thing away from typical wolf behavior. We've got coyotes living in places in the GTA here where a wolf could not possibly live, and they would just go insane and run out in the road and get killed, basically. So it doesn't make any sense to think that wolf ancestry would make coyotes less fearful of people or more able to live close to humans. Another thing we get asked a lot is the question of crossing between coyotes and dogs. And in fact, when we first started to study coyotes in Ontario in the late 1950s and early 60s, and it was noted that coyotes in the province were clearly different than western coyotes, but at that point it was still not, we didn't understand this history of hybridization with wolves. And people were sort of looking for answers or explanations as to what had happened to the coyotes or why they were different. And one of the things that we thought might be going on at that time was that perhaps there had been interbreeding with dogs. But work we've done since then in the advent of modern genetic techniques shows that, yeah, there are some cases where dog DNA is integressed into coyotes, but it's actually quite rare. And there's a few reasons why we don't see quote-unquote coy dogs out there, and I've listed those here, but I'll go over it very quickly. So you can take a dog and you can take a coyote and you can make them breed, and they can breed in captivity or under the right circumstances in the wild they can breed. If they do breed, the offspring that they produce are very infertile, so they're not going to have much chance of further breeding. Plus, as you'll see in a little bit, with both coyotes and wolves, it's very important for those wild coyotes and wild wolves that both parents participate in the rearing of pups and providing food for the pups. These coy dogs, if they are able to be produced, the males have no parental instinct, so they tend not to assist their mate in rearing the pups. Plus, the female coy dogs tend to come into heat a couple months early. So you've got a case where a female coy dog would be not very fertile, so she's not likely to get pregnant in the first place. If she does get pregnant, her pups are born in the middle of the winter time, and she doesn't have any mate to help rear those pups. So all those things contribute to the fact that if a dog and a coyote do breed, the offspring are very unlikely to persist in the wild, and we just don't see genetically on the landscape, we don't see evidence of much dog DNA making its way into our coyote population. So one of the big misconceptions about coyotes relates to their size. And we've weighed a lot of coyotes that we've captured and put radio collars on, and we've collected coyote carcasses from hunters and trappers, and we've weighed coyotes that have been hit on the road, and we've weighed a number of coyotes from Mississauga that we've gotten from Animal Services here. And it's a very rare coyote in the GTA or anywhere in the province that weighs much more than 40 pounds. And about 40 pounds is the typical weight for an adult male. Some are bigger. We did have one in Scarborough that was sort of mid-40s, but that's getting on the high side. And occasionally, somebody somewhere in southern Ontario will shoot or trap a coyote that might weigh over 50 pounds, but those are very rare indeed among the coyote population. So this radio-collared coyote at the bottom, this photograph was taken in Colonel Sam Smith Park. That's a very typical looking eastern coyote, and because we captured that animal and placed a tracking collar on it, we were able to weigh it, and 33 pounds is all that coyote weighed. So generally, most people, when you look at one, you think they weigh much more, you think they're much bigger than they really are. Just to sort of beat the point home a little further, this is an adult female from the Credit Valley golf course that I caught and a couple summers ago to place a tracking collar on. 32 pounds. And a few days after I collared her, we were on the golf course one evening, and she came out on the fairway, not too far away, and the golfers that I was talking to, they all gasped and pointed and said, "Jesus, that's as big as a German Shepherd." And I just weighed her a few days before, 32 pounds. So, and that's actually small. Most adult females would be a little bigger. So it's very typical. And if you go back through the newspaper articles over the last number of months, it's a very common thing. I bet I could find 6 or 7 or 8 articles, in the last several months where people are saying it was as big as a German Shepherd, big as a German Shepherd, big as a German Shepherd.
I wrote most of those articles, actually.
Okay.
Some of the experts I've spoken to, Bradley White down at Trent University,
Yeah.
he said that they've captured in New York and Eastern Ontario, they've captured them weighing up to 60 to 80 pounds.
1 in 5,000 or more.
They can't get that big.
It is possible, but you would weigh many, many thousand before you got one like that. Yeah, and that's. I mean, I know Brad well. We work together, but that's where he latches onto those exceptions and loses sight of the norm. Yeah.
Just for comparison, what does a German Shepherd weigh then?
Well, it depends how well you feed it. But they can weigh 100 pounds or more if they're well fed. Yeah. The other thing is that given a comparable frame, your typical coyote would weigh much less than your typical domestic dog, even if they had the exact same physical dimensions, just because they tend to be so much leaner and with the nice fluffy full coats. Yeah, I should have. Well, here, so these 2 coyotes. In the top, this is another adult female from Mississauga. This is her mate, and he wouldn't weigh more than 40, 41 pounds. Yeah, and he's noticeably bigger than her. She would be in the low 30s. Yeah. So, coyote social organization is centered around a breeding pair. I sort of alluded to that when I was talking about the genetics. And the basic social unit is a mating pair. Coyotes will be monogamous if they are able to. This pair in the photograph here, this was taken in Sam Smith Park as well. They've been together, that we know of, it'll be 3 years and another couple months that we've been following these animals, and they've been together most of that time. I had a breeding pair of coyotes that I studied many years ago in Nova Scotia that were together about 5 years until the breeding male died. And during that time, they spent most of their time together. So the basic social unit is the mated pair. What we refer to as a pack is, and this holds true with wolves and not just coyotes, a pack is essentially just a family. So if you saw 4 or 5 coyotes together in a park or somewhere on a golf course this winter, you're basically looking at a breeding pair, an unrelated breeding pair, and their offspring from the most previous, most recent litter. Sorry. Now, it's an interesting thing, and I think I'll talk about this a little more, but part of the work that I did when I was a grad student in Nova Scotia, we were interested in knowing whether pack formation had anything to do with hunting, and do they form these groups to hunt large prey like deer. And what we found was that actually wasn't true, and that because a pack is just a family, pack's family group size was biggest, and the groups were the most cohesive when there was the most food available, no matter what that food was. And it basically related to dispersal. So in a litter, if you've got a family of coyotes, you've got a breeding pair and their pups, there's a pecking order. And the smallest pups, the sort of runts of the litter, will be the last to eat. And so if food becomes scarce, those smaller pups in the pack will end up dispersing or leaving their parents' territory and striking out alone, thinking that they can do better on their own. So when food is abundant, you see less of that dispersal, and the pups stay longer with their family, and you get these groups sticking together longer. So a pack is basically a family.
What's the average number of pups in a litter?
Yeah, so the average number of pups in a litter is largely related. So the short answer would be about 5 or 6, but that can be quite variable. It increases with female age up to a point, and it increases with food a little bit. But so you could have a litter as large as 8 or 9 under ideal conditions, and a very young female under very poor conditions might only have 2 pups. Yeah. Howling is probably a bit of a non-issue for the most part in the most areas of the city, you're probably too much noise, you can't hear it. But certainly in the rural areas and where I live, you hear coyotes howling every night. And they're basically, coyotes are territorial, and we'll look at some maps in a minute about the way the territories are laid out. But howling is one way that you can tell your neighbors that you're still home and that you still occupy that territory, and that tells them that it's not worth their time to come over and try and take over your piece of land because you're still there. And it's a way of avoiding conflict, of avoiding fights, basically, because fights and conflict among different groups of coyotes are very, potentially dangerous and costly. So I guess I already gave this point away, but given that a pack is just a family, delayed dispersal of pups, so more pups are likely to stay with their parents longer when food is abundant, and it doesn't matter what that food is. That food could be squirrels or rabbits or even fruit in some cases. If there's enough food there, you'll have large cohesive groups of coyotes staying together through the winter. So this is a rural landscape. This is Prince Edward County, and we'll look at some stuff from Mississauga to show a contrast. Here, each yellow polygon is the territorial living area of a different radio collar group of coyotes. We didn't have collars on every coyote in the county, but in traveling around, we believe that the entire landscape was probably saturated with territories like this. So in an area like Prince Edward County, there was probably about 60 breeding groups of coyotes at any given time across the county, and the average territory size there is about 14.5 square kilometers. Territory size is a common theme is going to be that most things, almost everything in the coyote's life comes back to food, and territory size and population density in the landscape is strongly linked to food abundance. So in the most productive areas of North America, a coyote territory might only be 2 or 3 square kilometers. In the least productive areas of the continent, which would be areas like the Gaspé region of Quebec or areas sort of in the far northern edge of the Coyotes range, the territory size might be 110 or 120 kilometers, or Newfoundland as well, over 100 square kilometers for a single group of coyotes to etch out a living. So it's basically, they defend a chunk of land that's just big enough to provide all the necessities of life and no bigger. And that's one thing that tells us right away that in the urban landscape, it's actually, from a coyote's point of view, it's a pretty favorable landscape. There's a lot to eat. We'll get to that in a little bit. And coyote territories tend to be fairly small in the urban landscapes, only a few square kilometers. So it's a pretty productive environment for coyotes. So in the city, coyotes are still territorial. So where you have a reproductive group of coyotes, they will be defending from other breeding groups a fairly exclusive chunk of land. And this is just an example showing the living area of 3 different groups of animals a couple of years back. Now, whether you're in a rural area or you're in the city, you've got this layer then of resident animals across the landscape, and your resident animals are territorial, so the breeding groups don't overlap very much. So on any given piece of land, you probably only have one breeding group right on that exact spot. There's sometimes a little bit of overlap around the edges, but for the most part, they occupy exclusive areas. But I also talked about pups and how pups stay with their parents until basically there's not enough food or until they're mature, at which point they leave or they disperse. So we've got a layer of all those polygons, all those territories of the resident coyotes on the bottom here. So keep that in mind. On top of that, there's another layer in the coyote population of transient animals. So here I think it's just going to show you the movements of a resident animal. So it stays in the area. Here's a pup that's dispersed. Here's another pup that's dispersed. And while the residents are staying in their own little territories here, not going too far, you can see that again, in Prince Edward County, the transients are basically bouncing from coast to coast to coast to coast. And here they found a carcass pile actually put out by some farmers, so they're parking there for a little bit. But then they move a bit. So I mentioned in Prince Edward County that you might have 60 family groups or 60 packs of coyotes living there. Most of those packs are going to produce a litter of pups every year. Some of those pups will die, some of those pups will live. But for most of those packs, there's going to be some number of those pups that are going to disperse, so they're going to leave those territories and they're going to wander around at large like that. So you've got a fairly large number of animals that don't have a home, they're not resident, and they're wandering around the landscape. And in a rural environment, those animals are the main reason that coyote populations persist, even when hunting is quite intense, because if this pack is removed and that pack is removed, there's a bunch of single animals roaming around basically looking for a piece of vacant land, because unless a coyote finds an area to establish its own territory, and a mate to do that with, they'll never reproduce. Transient coyotes that don't have a territory and don't have an exclusive piece of land, they never successfully rear pups. It's just not been documented. Only territorial resident animals typically would be successful in rearing pups. So back to the city. So we've got an adult female here. In this case, she has a territory that's largely over a golf course. And we find that's a common theme, that in the city, green spaces like parklands and golf courses, those green spaces are heavily favored by coyotes. So that image I just showed you with the transient animals sort of wandering freely across the landscape, that doesn't work so well in the urban environment because of the geographic barriers. You've got highways, you've got cement walls, you've got canals, you've got different things. So the movements are a lot more constrained. And that's illustrated by the movements of an adult female here. We've got the adult female with her territory. We also radio collared an adult male. I think he was a sibling perhaps, because they seemed to tolerate each other's presence, but he wasn't contributing to that litter of pups. So on the 5th of May, he wasn't too far from this adult female's den. A few days later, he left. And I'll just sort of toggle through these, but you can see he would move from place to place and stop for, on time, maybe a couple weeks or sometimes more at these various stops along the way. Here it's up against the 403. Can't get across. 4 days basically walking back and forth before getting across the highway. 2 weeks in a small lot here, tiny lot. You would never, in a rural environment or a forested environment, you would never, ever see a coyote spend 2 weeks in an area that small. They just don't do that. And the only reason they do that, I would argue, in the urban environment is because of feeding. And it's either people are intentionally putting food out for coyotes or they're accessing garbage. If those conditions aren't met, that area is way too small to support a free-ranging coyote for 2 weeks. So here, this is Bray Bend Golf Course. You can see the coyote spent at least 5 weeks there. Most of you are familiar with that area, not a lot of bush. I would guess that in 5 weeks there wasn't a single location outside the golf course. And I'm guessing that after 5 weeks there probably weren't too many mice left or cottontails on the golf course. And it's the law of diminishing returns. After about 5 weeks, the coyote was probably finding that it was just taking too long to get a meal there, and it's time to move on. So it did. And again, another month in almost a small lot. And I'm going to come back to this little cluster in a bit, because again, when we observed a coyote spending a month in a tiny area like that in behind a bunch of houses, it just didn't make sense, because there really couldn't or shouldn't be enough natural food to support a coyote for that long. So when we see stuff like this, we go in and investigate and try and figure out what could be keeping the coyotes there for that long, and I'll definitely come back to that. So there are lots of geographic barriers, so the coyotes don't move as freely around the urban environment, but that's not to say that they don't still move extensively sometimes. So you can see here we had a dispersing coyote from the city, ended up way down in Niagara Falls, below Niagara Falls. And we were actually worried in this case, because these particular, so this data comes from a GPS collar. So it's a tracking collar that the coyote's wearing, and I showed you some in the pictures before. And they have a GPS on board, so that calculates the position using the satellites. But the data is sent to me by text message. So they've also got a cell phone modem on the collar, and every time the collar gets 6 locations, it sends me a text, and then I've got filters that sort of put all that into the mapping program on my computer. So that's sort of interesting, but I got scared when it got down close to Niagara Falls because I was worried about roaming fees. And but you might laugh, but if it started costing me 75 cents a text every time it sent me the data, I would have went out of business. Anyway, luckily it didn't happen. So another one, a yearling female. You can see getting down close. I think she ended up getting killed down here. But so the movements aren't quite as free in an urban environment, but they are able to move extensively, and it's not a closed system. So sometimes the issue of translocation comes up, and someone says, well, there's a coyote that's causing some problems in our neighborhood or in my backyard. Why doesn't somebody just catch it and move it? And there's a few reasons. I mean, one is that because of disease concerns and to prevent disease spread, the law states that an adult animal can't be moved any further than 1 kilometer from the point of capture. So for a coyote, that would probably put it inside the territory where it started. So all you're doing is basically leapfrogging it, from one part of its home to another part of its home, sort of like taking it from the kitchen to the bedroom. So that's not going to work. And in some cases, juvenile animals can be moved further. I think maybe up to 15 kilometers, but that again wouldn't be sufficient. 15 kilometers to a coyote is really not a big deal. We've had coyotes from Prince Edward County end up in Bobcaygeon. We've had wolves from the Algonquin area go 500-600 kilometers in some cases. So these animals are very mobile. We had actually, this is a slightly different critter, a bigger critter, but we had a wolf in Nakina in northern Ontario that went 124 kilometers in 24 hours. So they can move. So somebody asked about litter sizes. A fancy term we use when we talk about coyote reproduction is monestrous, and basically just means that they only have a single litter a year, so there's a single reproductive cycle per year. So they're not like rabbits or mice that are producing multiple litters. The breeding season is usually in February. Gestation is similar to dogs, about 9 weeks. So we're in the end of March now. It's possible that some coyotes would be born very soon. And we talked the same when we talked about body weight, how there's some outliers, there's some exceptions. Most pups will be born in mid to late April, but somewhere in southern Ontario there's probably pups on the ground already. It's just not that common. It would be a little early yet. And this is an important point. Both parents share in the pup rearing duties. So it's very important, especially when the female is nursing in the den. She can't go very far. She's not wanting to leave those pups. So it's either the mate, her mate, or perhaps if any of the pups from the last litter have decided to stick around, then they would also be expected to pull their weight, and they would go out and forage. And they would come back, just one sec, they'd come back, and they tend not to, if it's something small like a cottontail rabbit, they might carry the whole thing back to feed the pups, but generally they'll fill their bellies, and they come back, and then the pups come out and start licking around the mouth of the female, and it causes her to actually regurgitate the food, and then they eat the pre-chewed food.
Does their behavior change during when
Yep.
the pups are around?
So that's an important point, and so pups are born in a den, and because of some of the nasty realities like fleas and flying ants and other things, sometimes the dens have to be abandoned and they have to move to a new site. Even if they don't get sort of overrun with fleas, once the pups start to get a little more mobile, they move the pups from a den to what we call a rendezvous site. And if we were talking about wolves further north, we would talk about a rendezvous site as being usually like along a beaver meadow or something. There's usually water close by, and it's sort of a big meadow area. And you can tell you're at one because the grass is all flattened out, and there'll be lots of little pup scats around. And I mention this about wolves because I saw one here in the city that was, met every description for what you would expect to be a typical wolf rendezvous site. But it was that breeding group of coyotes on the Credit Valley Golf Course that I showed you that 32-pound female before. They had been seeing a single coyote on the golf course, and we went to check it out. And this is a couple years ago now. And by the 17th green, just down below there was a little grassy meadow, and as soon as we walked, the grass was all flattened out and it was beaten down, and I knew right away that this is a rendezvous site. There has to be a litter of pups here. So I mentioned that there's got to be a whole breeding group here. There has to be pups, and they said, "Oh no, we've only ever seen one adult, and we usually see it early in the morning." And as we were sitting there talking, and I could see little scats around that had to have come from pups. As we were talking, the raspberry cane started waving a bit, and a pup came walking out, and it had a raccoon bone in its mouth, and wasn't scared of us. It was about from me to Linda, and just laid down and started chewing on the bone. And three of us are standing here talking. Now you mentioned as the behavior change, about 2 days later or a day and a half later on the same golf course, we were actually going to try and catch some of the animals. So I had sent my coworker back to our residence to get some headlamps, and I was sitting there, and it was just getting dark, and I'm basically the only one left on the golf course at that point. And I walked around that 17th green, and the breeding female, I didn't know, but she had been laying in the sand bunker. It was really, really hot then, and she must have liked the cool sand. So the pups weren't far away, and as soon as she saw me, she jumped up and started growling and barking. And I went out in the middle of the fairway, and when I turned my back to her, and again, she's just a 32-pound female, not very big, but when I turned my back to her, she would run up very close and growl and bark. And if I turned around and stomped, she would run about 75 yards away. But every time I turned my back, she would come, fairly close, and wouldn't make contact, but would come close. But she just wanted me away from her pups, so I just started walking down the fairway, and she would growl and bark and even howl a bit. And I could hear her mate howling up in the trees. He wasn't quite as bold as she was. But by the time I got down to the tee box, so basically she walked me, escorted me the length of the fairway. Then she turned around and went back, and everybody was happy. And I think that happens a lot. When I read a lot of the newspaper accounts of conflict with coyotes, I think that's a similar scenario where perhaps a female or a group of coyotes have moved their pups overnight and moved them to basically a rendezvous site or a new location. And they do that at night when things are quiet. Then the next morning at the crack of dawn, there's people out walking their dogs. And when the coyotes made the move in the night, they didn't realize that it was going to be a popular spot the next morning. Somebody's walking their dogs. They get too close to where the pups are, and one of the adults will come out and growl and act tough and accost them. And in those kinds of scenarios, those are the situations that can be completely diffused by just giving the animal space. So, okay, I'm sorry, I got a little too close to you and your pups. I'm gonna walk away. I keep my eyes on the coyote. Get away, that's fine. They don't like that conflict either, so probably the next night they'll grab the pups and go somewhere else. And it might be trial and error. In the urban environment, the next 3 or 4 places they move their pups to might all be trouble. They might all be bad spots, but eventually they'll find a place that's quiet enough that they can sort of coexist without trouble. So that's a different type of conflict. That's different than a coyote that might be hungry in the wintertime and is looking at your small dog as a potential prey item. And we'll talk about those scenarios after. When I mentioned this, that young usually disperse in the fall. So most coyotes will leave their parents' territory, the territory they were born in, before their first birthday. We see a pulse of dispersal in October, and then the pups that stay with their parents after October, there's another little spike in dispersal around February, and that happens during the breeding season when the adults are sort of fixed on each other and breeding, and they get a bit jealous and aggressive towards any pups that might be viewed as competitors for breeding. So you see another spike in dispersal then. And then any remaining pups, there's the final little spike in dispersal usually is in April when just before the new litter is born. Most of those last remaining pups that are still in their parents' territory will leave at that time. So if we're talking about coyotes in Mississauga, or we're talking about coyotes in Kemptville or in Peterborough, wherever we're talking about them, it's probably easier to talk about what a coyote might not eat rather than what they do eat, because basically if you go outside and just sort of sample what's out there in the landscape, anything that's out there that's even remotely edible is likely being fed upon by at least some coyotes. They've got an extremely diverse diet, and we look at their diet by sifting through their droppings in the summertime and in the winter. And when a coyote gets killed by any cause, often we'll open up the stomach and look at the stomach contents to see what they've been eating. And there isn't much that we have not seen in the stomach of a coyote. If it's edible, they'll eat it. We think in Ontario, like it's sheep that are the livestock that sort of coyotes come into the most conflict with. But in the southern states, one of the agricultural issues involving coyotes relates to watermelon. And in Mississippi, for example, the amount of loss to watermelon crops is huge because coyotes will go and take a bite out of each watermelon and then move along and take a bite of another one. And they're basically ruining the melon but not cleaning it up. In terms of the amount of food, there's a point in there just about for an average sized coyote, you're looking at about a kilogram. Maybe for a big coyote, maybe 1.5 kilograms of sort of fresh meat would be required on an average day to sustain them. And also, like wolves, they also are well adapted to this sort of feast-fast strategy. So if they find a large kill, if the coyotes are able to kill a deer, for example, and really gorge and fill their bellies, then it would be okay to go 3 or 4 or 5 days before another meal. So this is back on the Credit Valley Golf Course, I think, and this is a breeding female. She's a little mangy. You can see she's got a cottontail rabbit that she's bringing back to the pups. This is a little bit gory, but that's nature. These meadow voles and cottontail rabbit remains were taken out of the stomach of a coyote that was killed on the road right in the heart of Mississauga. So the point is, and even of gory slides like that, even in an urban environment, most of the coyote diet remains natural. So the coyotes are spending a lot of their time in the green spaces, and they're feeding on voles, meadow voles. They're feeding on cottontail rabbits. They're feeding on squirrels, and as you know, sometimes they're feeding on cats and small dogs as well. In terms of livestock, and I know we're not too concerned about that here tonight in the city, but from a coyote's point of view, wherever they are, the equation that's running through their mind when it comes to feeding themselves is, how can I get the most calories in my belly with the least amount of energy expended and the least amount of risk? So what's the laziest way to fill my belly and not get shot? In a lot of cases, that makes livestock very appealing because, unlike the wild prey in their territory, the livestock are confined to fixed pastures, so they're very predictable in space. They know exactly where they are. Sheep are generally very defenseless compared to a lot of the wild prey. So often I think it's surprising that livestock aren't used or aren't preyed on more by coyotes than they already are, because it's from a coyote's point of view, it's often very energetically favorable. So when we're talking to livestock producers about trying to prevent coyote depredation on their flocks, I mean, one of the things if we can get people thinking like this, when you put up fencing or you get guard dogs or use other sort of scare devices to try and keep coyotes away, you're basically trying to tip the balance of the equation so that it's more difficult for a coyote to come and attack a sheep on your property than it would be for them to go off and hunt something wild somewhere. And the same can be said when it comes to protecting your pets in your yards, basically, that if you have a property that backs up against a wooded ravine or some other green space, it's a given that coyotes are going to be traveling by there. And if you have small pets that are sort of running free and unattended, and if things aren't well lit and your yard isn't fenced, from the coyote's point of view, you're offering a meal that might be more predictable and easier to get than some of the wild things that they would normally go after. So it's not surprising that small pets sometimes are viewed as prey. Yep.
How likely would they be to jump a fence or try and get into a fenced area?
So fencing, again, going back to the sort of this way of thinking, you can get coyote-proof fencing, but it's very expensive. It has to be tall, and you have to have some skirting at the bottom that prevents them from going under. But even a very typical sort of 4-foot fence around your yard will keep most coyotes out. If they're very determined and very motivated to cross it, they can jump that fence, but most of the time they won't bother.
And lighting is a deterrent or no?
Yeah, it helps, and it's all these sort of best practices, and I'll get into those more specifically later, but it's the same as if we were talking about protecting our sheep. There's nothing that I can sit here and tell you other than keeping pets inside that's 100% effective, but there's a lot of things that can greatly reduce the chances of ever having a conflict, and fencing and lighting are included in that. Yep.
So how high, if we had, these chain link fence, and then we wanted to, it's a 4-foot fence, so say put 2 of them up and you put it halfway up, so it's now 6 feet, or should it be 7 feet? How high?
But again, if you're looking for a distance that they absolutely can't get over, it's you could have something like snowdrift up against it. So again, typically even a shorty's fence will keep most of them out, because why jump over it unless you're really motivated? So they'd have to really want to get across it. But I think, I don't know the exact limit of how high they could jump, but it wouldn't be, a highly motivated coyote could probably get over a 6-foot fence. Yeah.
I have a 100-pound shepherd in my backyard with a 5-foot fence all around, and I have a coyote that sits on the other side of my fence, looking at it at night. My dog has part Alaska Malamute in it, so it wants to stay out all night,
Yep.
and it won't stay out all night anymore.
It's scared? Yeah. That's actually interesting, yeah, because
Yeah,
a lot of dogs aren't, that should be scared, aren't scared,
she's very
and are curious, yeah.
she's got something wrong.
Anyway, I'm gonna move on. So, I mentioned this earlier, how everything links back to food, and coyote abundance is strongly a function of the amount of food out in the landscape. So here, this is from a very simple system in the Yukon where snowshoe hare and red squirrels were the primary prey of coyotes. Each year along the x-axis, we've got a measure of snowshoe hare density, and then here we've got coyote density. And you can see that over time, as hare densities increased, coyote numbers followed with a lag of about 1 year. Hare numbers peaked and started declining. Coyote numbers dropped as well. So a pretty tight relationship. Things were a little more noisy with my work in Nova Scotia, but when we combined the biomass of white-tailed deer and snowshoe hare on those forested landscapes, it was still a pretty good relationship between the combined biomass of deer and hare in our study areas and the coyote densities the next year. So provincially, we have some understanding of coyote density in certain areas from the radio tracking studies that we've done. And because coyotes are territorial, particularly in a rural landscape, all you really need to know is how big the average territory size is, how many animals live in those territories, and then how many animals don't live in territories that are sort of wandering around. If you have all those pieces of the equation, you can come up with a pretty good estimate of the number of coyotes running around in the landscape. It's a little tougher in the city because one of the things we don't know, I can tell you how big the territories were for all the different animals that we collared and tracked in different parts of the city, but what we don't really know here is what parts of the city might be not coyote habitat at all. So are there coyotes in the city that spend all of their time in residential neighborhoods and that have territories that don't have any green space, for example? We're not aware of those. Like so far, most of the coyotes that we've seen spend most of their time in green spaces and then sort of wander out and make little foraging trips into neighborhoods, generally at night, but sometimes in the daytime, and then come back. Anyway, so when we talk about coyote population trends in Ontario, as I say, we have some estimates of sort of absolute density from different studies we've done in different areas, but in terms of general trends over time, we rely on observations by deer hunters. So a certain percentage of the deer hunters are given a questionnaire like this, and this one on the screen is from moose hunters in the north, but it's the same idea for deer hunters in southern Ontario, and they're asked to provide information on the number of days they spend hunting and also on the number of coyotes that they saw, and from that we come up with a population index based on the number of coyotes seen per hunter day. And when we look at that across southern Ontario, you can see that there was a real low in numbers in most areas of the province, around 2,000. And at that time, coyotes were just coming off of a bad bout of mange. Mange was quite prevalent. Numbers were low. And then through the 2000s, the numbers, they seemed to recover from mange, the parasitic skin infection, and food abundance. Deer numbers generally were increasing across much of the province at that time, and coyote numbers increased as well. The bit that's surprising to some folks is that in most areas, coyote numbers probably peaked around 2010, and depending on the district, they have either stabilized or declined slightly in most areas since that time. But when I say declined slightly, we have to put that into context. Numbers are still, considerably higher than they were around 2000 or 2001 when they were at a sort of recent low. So in the GTA or Aurora district in general, a similar trend, increasing through the 2000s, peaked around 2010, and slight decline to stable since then.
What's the number on the other axis? Number of coyotes per...
This is the number of coyotes seen per 100 hunter days. So from all those report cards, there might be 10,000 hunter days of data available, and the average number seen per 100 hunter days ranges from a low of about 10 to a high of about 25. No, so this is just your surrounding landscapes in the district. And you're right, that makes it difficult for the city itself.
How do you know that they aren't seeing the same coyotes?
It doesn't. They might be, but it doesn't really matter because this index is really just we're only interested in changes over time. So as long as the proportion of repeat observations stays constant, then it's not biased. So we don't really. It's really more useful for a given area over time because one M&R district, one district in the landscape might have more fields than another that has more forests. So it's hard to compare the actual numbers between two districts and say this district has more coyotes than that one because the observations, the sightability is different. So we really only use it for a given area to look at trend over time. Okay, so coyotes, going back to the start of the presentation, I talked about how when we colonized North America, coyotes were restricted to the Central Plains area of the continent. Wolves had a very broad distribution across most of the continent. We cleared the land for agriculture, for settlement, and we also were able to eradicate wolves from most of North America. And we've proven through numerous examples that we can eradicate wolves. But most jurisdictions, when coyotes first showed up, most jurisdictions had a bounty on coyotes. And to my knowledge, no jurisdiction has ever been able to eliminate or greatly reduce coyote numbers. And no bounty program on coyotes anywhere in North America has ever really had any measurable success. And there's some biological reasons why they're different. And then one of the big ones is just the space. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but because coyotes are small, relatively small, and they have small territory sizes, there can be a lot of territories on the landscape that can exist at fairly high densities. Wolves, on the other hand, are larger, they have higher food requirements, they have bigger territories, and it's basically hard for a wolf to hide. If we had wolves in southern Ontario, there would be really no wolf territory. Like the average territory size would be 100 to 150 square kilometers. And if you took a 100 or 150 square kilometer polygon in southern Ontario and tried to move it anywhere you put it, there's going to be so much road density and so many people that it's really going to be difficult for those animals to survive any length of time. And some coyotes are dying all the time, but we've always got some of those small territories that are surviving, so there's a bit of a spatial component there. But we don't want to spend too much time on that tonight. Suffice it to say that bounties have been proven time and time again to be ineffective at reducing coyote numbers. So the first coyote showed up in Ontario in 1919, I mentioned. There was actually a bounty in place when they showed up here. It was on wolves. As soon as coyotes showed up, it was quickly amended to include coyotes. And for the first 53 years that we had coyotes in the province, they expanded their range and expanded their numbers during a bounty program. And the bounty in the province wasn't eradicated. The provincial bounty until 1972, and some municipalities continued to pay bounties until 1991. So really, during that time, that coyotes expanded in distribution and numbers. They did that despite there being a bounty in place. So now we're going to focus a little bit for a few minutes on some of the very specific findings from the urban coyote work. And to sort of start with a summary, you should consider that most of the landscapes across the GTA would be occupied at least some of the time by coyotes. And it's not just the GTA, but I would say at this point that for at least the last a decade or maybe 2 decades, probably every urban area in Ontario, and in recent years it's extended to our urban areas in northern Ontario. Now places like Red Lake and Sioux Lookout have coyote populations in the municipalities. So coyotes are probably in every urban area in the province. And urban areas, initially when coyotes started showing up in cities, some of the early thinking was that, oh, the city must be marginal habitat for the coyotes, and it must mean that the landscape is full out in the country, and that these animals, poor animals, are forced to come and live in the city. But once we started doing work, and once other people started doing work on urban coyotes, we realized that actually, in a lot of ways, that the city is a great environment for coyotes. There's a lot to eat here, and the point was made just a few minutes ago that for the most part there isn't hunting and trapping inside city limits. So it's in some ways it's a bit of a safer environment. They do have to learn to contend with high traffic volume and people, but for the most part they're able to do that. Now, I'd say they're able to do that, but most of the coyotes that we radio collared in the city, within a year or two, they probably more than half the ones we collared end up being killed on a road somewhere in the city. But they do learn to deal with traffic better than their country bumpkin cousins. There's good video from a radio collared coyote in the city of Chicago crossing a very major roadway in the city, and as it goes out to halfway across the road, it knows to look this way because the cars are coming this way. When it gets to the halfway point, it turns its head and starts looking this way, and knows that the vehicles are coming that way. So it knows where the traffic changes. So one thing that allows coyotes to, adapt well to the city is their ability to acclimate to loud noises. So here, a radio collared coyote was using the off-ramp, the median, or the green space in the middle of the off-ramp as a daybed. And they were resting there in the daytime. And if you and I were to go and stand there, we would have to basically yell to hear each other speak because of all the traffic noise. And this is a case where I mentioned before about behavioral differences between coyotes and wolves. You could never, ever, ever convince a wolf to lay down and have a nap in a spot like this with that much background noise. That they just, behaviorally, they could not adapt to that. But coyotes can quite readily adapt. Did you have?
Last year in my neighborhood, the animal control people put down quite a number of raccoons because they were doing strange things, coming out in the daytime, chasing after people in the daytime, hanging around on roofs, sunning themselves in the daytime. And I don't really know what was wrong with them, but what is the likelihood that a coyote eating a raccoon like that would pass on some kind of a weird disease and spread it everywhere?
Well, most of the diseases that could be related to, the coyotes have probably already been exposed to. And that's one thing about coyotes in the south is that they get, if we were to go and draw blood from a coyote and check its antibodies, you would generally find quite high titer levels for distemper, parvovirus, canine influenza, all the sort of common viral diseases. They seem to be exposed to them at a young enough age, and rabies as well. And they're not common rabies vectors even because most coyotes tend to be immune because they get low-level exposures and they develop antibodies. So occasionally distemper or parvovirus will kill an animal, but the majority of the time they just develop their own antibodies, and they're really not a, we tend to think though coyotes and rabies, but coyotes are really an uncommon rabies vector. It's possible for them to get rabies and to transmit it, but it's much more common to be spread by other animals like raccoons and fox and bat. Yep. Right. Yeah, so I'm trying to think. I don't know if we've even had a single coyote or wolf pup die of distemper. We've had a couple die of parvo out of many hundred that we've sampled. So I talked before, I had the map up showing the movements in the urban environment. And one of the things that coyotes really key in on in an urban environment are rail lines. Rail lines provide a way to move fast within the city, but also a way in and out of the city. And so it's a big thing. Other ravines and green spaces, our parks often tend to be along water courses or ravines, so they really make for good linear corridors, that that really provide for travel routes for coyotes and allow different groups to be connected. Now, I mentioned this before, though, that these locations are the radial locations of collared animals. You can see that they're largely focused on green spaces or old industrial lots or golf courses. You saw this picture earlier of the pups having some fun in the bunker. I think the guys had to rake all the bunkers every morning. So another characteristic, I guess, of coyotes in urban environments is the whole issue of conflict. I think this picture came from Ottawa, and you can see a coyote running through a schoolyard. Generally, the perception of the problem is bigger or worse than the actual problem. I mentioned that scenario a while ago about the female escorting me down the fairway. I understood what was going on, understood the animal, and knew that if I sort of faced her and maintained a bit of aggression, that there was no way she was going to come in and make contact. But if I had been there and didn't know what was happening, and for example, if I had have turned around and ran down the fairway, it wouldn't have been surprising if she came up and nipped at the back of my calves or something. She might well have bitten me, and that would be recorded as an attack, when really all she wanted was for me to get away from her area.
Last year in Brent, sort of in the fall, there were 3 people bitten, sort of through the summer to the fall. And one of the incidents, the woman was just taking something out of the back of her car. The guy snuck up behind her in the cab.
Yep.
And then she went to her, tried to get into the house, did this, and she was supposed to, backed up, and the thing followed her straight up to her stairs and kind of watched her until she went in the house and didn't leave when her husband came out and made noise. And there's been a few interactions where they kind of showed no fear, kind of in the Lorne Park area.
That one sounds like a classic case of habituation. We had a radio collared coyote just west of Algonquin about 10 years ago now, and it was hanging out near one of the little restaurant gas stations west of the park, and people were feeding it, and we told folks, this is bad, you got to stop. If you continue to feed this animal, it's likely going to end up dead. But people kept feeding it, and what eventually happened was very similar to what you just described. A lady arrived there with a bag of groceries, didn't know anything of the history of what had been going on there, got out of her car, she had a bag of steaks or something, and the animal came up and accosted her, wanted the steaks, and she sort of said, shoo, get away, and turned around and walked with her bag of steaks, and it ran up and bit her on the calf. She ran in the house, and it did the same. It followed her right up to the doorstep, and it wanted that food, and it had had a history of being given the food, and that was it. As soon as that happened, then the animal had to be destroyed. But that was a clear case where, that animal became habituated. It associated people with food because that's what we did. So, most wild animals have an innate fear of people, so that the typical wildlife response to people is avoidance. In areas where we have a history of non-conflict, like in areas where animals are predator-free, sometimes they lose their fear of people, or in areas where they haven't been hunted for many generations. So that would be, and in some cases, there might be some attraction there. And then a third sort of behavioral state that we refer to would be habituation, where animals that are initially fearful of people learn to not be scared of people because of food rewards. And when we talk about food rewards in coyotes, there's direct handouts, so there's actually people that might think they're doing a favor by putting some food out because it's been a long, tough winter. But there's also unintentional feeding, which can be just improper storage of dog food in your backyard or in your shed, or even just improper storage of garbage. And in the urban area, I'm sure you folks all know this better than me, but you go to any of those little parks or green spaces and walk on the paths in the woods there, and when you start really looking at the amount of litter and potential food there, it's really quite high. So I think we've talked about this, a positive experience, so associating people with food can turn a coyote that used to be scared of people into one that now not only is not scared of people, that is actually viewing us as a source of food and is intentionally sort of seeking out people and human residences as a means of getting food. So I showed you this picture earlier, this is the little cluster of locations. After the coyote left the Bray Bend golf course, it went over and spent several weeks in this small area. My comment was that it's highly unusual for an animal to spend 3 weeks in that small of a wooded lot, and that in a typical rural or wooded environment you would never see a coyote spend that much time in an area like that. So we went in and had a look, and there was lots of garbage and refuse there, so lots of food. And this is a clear case, and if too bad I didn't have the sort of broader scale map, but in a case like this, if there was absolutely no food of any sort in that woodlot, the coyote would come in. It might spend 24 or 48 hours in there, catch a few mice or a cottontail or two, and then it's going to move on. By providing that food, you're keeping a coyote in that small area for at least 3 weeks. This one probably stayed longer. And the longer the animal is staying in that small area, exposed to that many people, that many pets, the longer it's in that small area, the greater the chance is that there's going to be a conflict. There's going to be a negative encounter. It's really a sort of a ticking time bomb. Something's going to happen the longer you keep it there. So we can keep the animals wild and keep them moving on by eliminating those food attractants. This is another case. Radio-collared coyote kept coming back to one spot. We were pretty curious as to what was happening. This is a couple years ago. I think this situation's been fixed. We ended up photographing the coyote feeding up against this fence. Took a closer look, and folks were dumping the grease out of their deep fryers over the back fence, and coyote was coming regularly feeding them, and then they would watch. So simple message, but is shown time and time again. Eliminating all those sources of food will go a long way towards preventing conflict with coyotes. So the other thing that our radio tracking studies in the city have demonstrated is that it's not all coyotes that are eventually going to get into conflict with people. And we've got numerous examples now of radio-collared coyotes living in areas where most people don't even know they are, and they live out their lives completely undetected and maintain a fairly natural existence. An example is in Tommy Thompson Park. Lots of people walk dogs there, lots of human use. There's been coyotes, family groups of coyotes, one family group at any given time, living there for many years, and I'm not aware of any issues there. And during the time that we were monitoring this coyote out there, I don't even think there were very few sightings even. People mostly didn't know that the coyotes were there. So it really then comes down to the question of what is the risk? And first thing I would say is that both wolves and coyotes, they're predators. I mean, coyotes in a wild environment, they make a living by killing things, eating things with their teeth. So do wolves. So they're predators, and they must be respected as being a potentially dangerous animal, because that's how they make their living. But the fear of being attacked by a coyote is generally, we give them, the fear is greater than the real risk there. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we could get into the whole discussion around the psychology of the big bad wolf and why we're scared of things. But if we just look at the raw numbers, the risk of anybody in this room being attacked by a coyote, or anybody you know being attacked by a coyote, is very, very small compared to the risk of someone you know or even yourself being injured, maybe even seriously injured, in any number of other sort of common things. And many of those things are things that we choose ourselves. Most weekends this winter, we had people in Ontario dying on snowmobiles somewhere, most weekends. In the summertime, there won't be very many weekends this summer that'll pass where someone isn't killed in a boating accident or drowning somewhere. Those are all activities that we voluntarily do, and the risk is much, much greater. Look at the deaths on our roads. I mean, transportation is essential, so maybe that's not a fair comparison, but there's all sorts of ways that you can hurt yourself, and the risk of you or anyone you know being hurt by a coyote is very slim compared to a very long list of other common hazards that we all face. Having said that, we all need to do our part to minimize the risk, and not only for ourselves and our own loved ones, but for our neighbors and the community at large. If you feed a coyote and you help that animal become habituated and suddenly it begins to associate people with food, it might not be you or your family members or your pets that end up having a negative encounter with that, but it might be somebody living a kilometer away or down the road that you've caused a problem for. So, never attempt to tame a coyote, in case you didn't know that.
Anybody ever try?
They don't make good pets. Often I'll talk about coyotes and wolves in the sort of the same tone, but I know of several cases where people have taken either a coyote pup or a wolf pup from a den and tried to rear them in the house, and it usually goes well until they start to mature. And then as they start to mature, it starts to go south quick, and they get very nippy and bitey, and yeah, it's not a good idea. So I mentioned this earlier. If in the unlikely event you are faced with an aggressive coyote or a coyote that's not fearful, so normal coyote behavior is to be fearful of people. When you see one, it should be scared of you. Sometimes in the urban environment, just because they've lived close to people for so long, they're not scared of you, but that still doesn't mean that they're going to be aggressive towards you. It just means that they've seen thousands of people, and they've learned to realize that we're not all trying to shoot or trap them. If you see a coyote that you perceive might be potentially dangerous or threatening, don't turn your back. Make sure it knows you're human. Make lots of noise. Make yourself look big, and then walk away. Get out of the space, but keep your eyes on the animal as you do that. You can use whistles or other sort of noise devices, air horns, things like that. At any point in time, if you think that if you have good grounds to believe that there's a coyote that poses a serious risk to you or anyone, and it's a human safety issue, then call 911. So cats and dogs can be seen as prey. Keep your dogs on a leash. A lot of the dog attacks that I'm aware of, sometimes they get reported in the media as, well, I had the dog on the leash and coyotes ran out and attacked it anyway. And when we follow up on cases like that, quite a few of those cases, when you really push, the dog actually wasn't on a leash. It wasn't actually on a leash, but it was only from here to the back of the room away. Well, are you sure it was only that far away? Well, maybe a little further away, but I could still see it. Well, are you sure you could see it? Well, I saw it when it came running back. And that all started as it was on the leash. So I'm not saying that it's impossible that a coyote would run out and bite a dog on a leash, because that can happen. I'm sure that has happened. But more often than not, when a dog is attacked, it is off leash. So we talked about fencing. If you're really serious about keeping your pets safe, keep them inside at night. We don't want to get into the philosophy around cats. I mean, a cat outdoors wandering around is at risk, period. And good advice, spay or neuter your dogs. Especially in the wintertime, you don't want that to be an additional attractant to coyotes, having a dog in heat, for example. So, Linda's going to talk probably more about this, but I'll just touch briefly on some of this. In the province of Ontario, landowners are responsible for managing wildlife on your own property. And the city is a landowner of some land in the city. The province is a landowner of some crown land. And most of you in the room here perhaps are landowners of some property where you live as well. To whatever extent you're a landowner, you're responsible for managing problem wildlife on your own property. The M&R or the city can provide advice, best practices. Some of the information I've talked about tonight can be given to you in the form of fact sheets or websites, things like that. We can put you in touch with people who are authorized agents who can participate in helping to deal with problem wildlife. So we're basically, in that way, a bit of a broker. The Fish and Wildlife Heritage Conservation Act basically provides that landowners can defend their property against wildlife. So if you're a pet owner or a livestock owner and something like a coyote is harassing your pet or your livestock, you can harass that animal, you can kill that animal. Of course, in a municipality, you have to make sure that whatever you're doing is in adherence with, for example, no firearms discharge bylaws that are certainly in place in the GTA, things like that. So you have to keep in mind other aspects of the law, but you have the authority to do what you have to do to protect your property, I guess is the bottom line there. So I got to run out of the room in about 10 minutes, so I think I'll wrap things up by saying that I've tried to paint a picture of the coyote, basically like any other wild animal that's an animal that's basically just trying to hack a living. They're very adaptable. They've obviously done very well in urban environments and in rural environments. And things that bring coyotes into conflict with people generally are the result of some combination of the coyotes trying to basically feed themselves and reproduce and some sloppiness on our behalf in terms of the way we've sort of done things. The GTA, Ontario, we're not alone in having conflict with coyotes and having issues. Coyotes aren't a very popular animal in most places in North America. Most jurisdictions have developed strategies and have learned to successfully coexist with coyotes, and that's really an essential thing. I mean, a few years ago, I sort of said this in only half joking. If Mississauga or if the broader GTA really wanted to not have coyotes or not have coyote issues, beyond all these garbage issues and feeding issues, another strategy would be just to get rid of all the green spaces. If there were no golf courses anywhere in the city, and if there were no parks and no trees, basically, and no grasslands, there would be next to no coyotes. But obviously, that's not somewhere where anyone wants to go. So we've created beautiful coyote habitat in the city that has lots of food and cover and all the essentials of life. So because those are the conditions that we've created in the city, it only follows that animals like coyotes are also going to call those areas home, and now we have to develop strategies to coexist.
You didn't really explain why, between bounties on the coyotes, never controlled the population. Why did that happen?
Well, I think it's, if you go back to that map of Prince Edward County, and just use the county as a small example with 60 territories there, but you can extend that and think of all southern Ontario. If there was a bounty in place today, we might eliminate some percentage of those coyote packs or family groups on the landscape, but there's going to be a fairly high number of packs or family groups whose territories fall inside parks, fall inside protected areas, fall inside the properties of people who aren't allowing hunting and trapping, and every pack, wherever it lives, is producing those pups, and those pups are dispersing every year, so there's a continued, those are like buffer, it's a continued influx of new animals that are filling in all the vacancies that are created when coyotes are removed. So basically, if you had a landscape where every square inch of the landscape was exposed to hunting and trapping, then it would be possible, but that scenario is completely unrealistic basically anywhere in North America. And the difference between coyotes and wolves is that wolves have such an extensive space use, have such large territories, that it doesn't matter if half the landscape is protected. Most wolf territories spill out into unprotected areas, and so those wolves are vulnerable. So it's really the smaller body size of coyotes means that they can have smaller territories. Smaller territories means that there'll always be a number of territories on the landscape that are protected, that are safe, and those territories are providing a continued influx of pups that repopulate the surrounding areas where they're being exploited. That seems to be what's happening. So, last slide, sort of a reminder, just having a coyote hopefully does not constitute a problem, or seeing a coyote. And when we go back to those protection of property provisions, having a coyote on your property isn't grounds for taking action under the protection of property provisions. That doesn't mean that you're at risk or that there's an imminent threat there. It has to go beyond that. overwhelmingly, in the majority of cases where there's conflict with coyotes, it relates back to coyotes having learned to associate us with food. And again, I've said this many times tonight, that can be intentional through some people actually feeding the coyotes actively, or it can be completely unintentional through just garbage being close to houses and garbage being close to people, pet food, things like that being left out in areas where they can get them. It doesn't matter to the coyote. They don't know whether I threw a half a sub down in the park intentionally to feed a coyote or whether I was just sloppy and threw it there. It doesn't matter to the coyote. All that matters is that that's human food, that was good, highly digestible, easy for it to eat. I mentioned this. I mentioned the best practices. If you do encounter an animal that you think might be threatening, and always, if there's a real risk to human safety, then call 911. Yep. Yep.
Does the coyote see that as aggression, or is it something that he will get away from?
If your dog is acting aggressively and you're sort of pulling it back on the leash, in most cases that will help your cause. You know, that's going to cause the coyote to delay. Like they're not. It's very unlikely that they're going to see that aggression as something that instigates, you know, an attack. So you would still pull your animal, you know, pull yourself, get out of the space, and you're probably going to be okay. It's where there might be a problem sometimes is a small dog. If a coyote is hungry and is for whatever reason is motivated to take a small dog as prey, once they make that decision that I'm going to eat this dog, once they actually start the act of predation, it can be very hard to dissuade them. You know, and you can have a coyote, you know, biting a small dog. You can be kicking it and hitting it with a stick, and if it's very fixed on that act, it might be very hard to dissuade. And that doesn't happen all the time, but I've seen that happen a few times with both coyotes and wolves, where once they start the attack, they get complete tunnel vision. They're totally focused on that, and it's very difficult to stop. Yep.
What is your life expectancy?
So what is the life expectancy of a coyote? If they don't get shot or trapped or hit by a car, it's very similar to a dog. They might be 12 or 13 years old. But generally,
How about coyote?
no, that's what I mean. Like a coyote would, if they didn't get hit by a car, they didn't get shot, or they didn't get trapped, they might live to be, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13 in that range. But in southern Ontario, whether it's in a rural environment or in an urban environment, given all the hazards that they face, you know, even 5 is getting old for a coyote. You know, the average age of a coyote that's killed might be 3 or 4 years.